APRV, or airway pressure release ventilation, has been around for a long time. It's funny because I've been using this mode for over 10 years now, but many that I speak with think that it's a rather new mode of ventilation. In fact, it was copyrighted by Stocks and Downs clear back in 1987. Its popularity really began in other countries and in essence has only been used on a fairly large scale here in the United States recently. I have spoke on this topic to several different groups, and I get some therapists who tell me that not only is this their primary mode of ventilation, but they have signs in their department that actually say SIMV is not a mode of ventilation. Now, don't get me wrong, APRV is actually my favorite mode of ventilation, and I do appreciate their enthusiasm, but I have to disagree. All modes of ventilation serve a particular purpose, and no one mode of ventilation or ventilator strategy can possibly work on all patients. Therefore, in my opinion, it is essential to understand all modes and all strategies and be prepared to use any of them at any given time. Now, you may have heard APRV by a different name. Remember, APRV is a trademark name. So when the other ventilator companies caught wind of how awesome this mode of ventilation was, they all wanted to jump on board. But since they couldn't use the same name, they had to create their own. So you may have used APRV as either bi-vent or bi-level. They also had to add some slight tweaks in order to not be selling the exact same product, so you might have an option of using pressure support and or PEEP, whereas traditionally you couldn't use this in the original form of APRV. But for the most part, all the strategies are basically the same. You may also hear doctors or therapists refer to this mode as open lung mode of ventilation. It's called this as we are holding the lungs open for a longer period of time than usual. We'll get into all this a little bit later. But basically, this mode was derived from the inverse ratio mode of ventilation. And another way to look at this mode is as interrupted CPAP. Again, I'm going to explain all this as we go along. In order to really understand APRV, we have to look at where it came from. And as I just mentioned, it came from inverse ratio ventilation. So we're going to spend the next portion of this lecture talking about inverse ratio ventilation. Now, in normal ventilation, we have what is called an I to E ratio, I being inspiratory and E being expiratory. So we have an inspiratory-expiratory ratio. The normal I to E ratio is right around 1 to 2, and these numbers are measured in seconds, so you have roughly 1 second in and 2 seconds out. So in inverse ratio ventilation, we flip this completely upside down, and we have a longer inspiratory time and a shorter expiratory time. So you may see the I to E ratio being 2 to 1 or even much higher. I've seen it as high as a 9 to 1 I to E ratio. But why in the world would we ever want to do this? Well, there are some very specific advantages that we get with inverse ratio ventilation that we just cannot get from other modes. Inverse ratio ventilation can 1. Improve your oxygenation. 2. It can help an alveolar recruitment. And last, it can improve pulmonary edema. And this last one is one that most people just don't think about. Let's go over each one of these benefits in a little more detail. First of all, we said that inverse ratio ventilation will improve oxygenation. We all know that oxygen must be in contact with the alveolar wall in order for gas exchange to take place. So if instead of having a 1 second inspiratory time, we now have say maybe a 3.5 or 4 second inspiratory time, basically what we are doing is we're holding that oxygen in the lungs against the alveolar membrane for a longer period of time. This gives it more time for the process of diffusion to actually take place. Second, we said that APRV will help to recruit alveoli. Let's go back to just basic ventilation for a moment. if the normal inspiratory time is roughly 1 second, what traditionally happens is you get uneven gas distribution. Because the simple law of physics says that what the air is going to do is it's going to move along the path of least resistance. So if you have some collapsed or partially collapsed alveoli, and you have some alveoli that's completely opened up, what the air is going to do is it's going to travel to the open alveoli first, thus creating overdistension of this already recruited airway and underdistension of the collapsed and or partially collapsed alveoli. Now, if you increase that inspiratory time to say 3 seconds, you will still get some of this overdistension, underdistension issue, but the air now has more time to open up that collapsed alveoli or create alveolar recruitment. And of course, if you have more functional alveoli, then again, this ultimately is going to prove oxygenation and ventilation both. At this point, I think it's important to discuss alveolar recruitment just a little bit more. Oftentimes, I've heard someone say to use PEEP to recruit alveoli, or that PEEP indeed does recruit alveoli. And this just simply is not true. PEEP, by definition, can't recruit alveoli. Now, as we know, PEEP stands for positive end expiratory pressure. So this is a pressure that exists at the end of the expiratory phase. Now think about it. How much of your alveoli is actually popping open as you exhale? Absolutely none of it. And if that's true, then there's no way that PEEP, an expiratory maneuver, will recruit alveoli. Now when we exhale naturally, we don't exhale all the air out of our lungs. There's a certain amount of air that remains trapped in our lungs, so that way our lungs don't completely collapse every time we breathe out. Now that amount of air that's trapped in our lungs is called FRC, or functional residual capacity. Now when we bypass the upper airways with an artificial airway, we take the lungs' protective mechanism away from being able to trap that air in our lungs. So PEEP is added to prevent the lungs from completely de-recruiting during the expiratory phase of ventilation. So when you think about it, the main job of PEEP is to mimic a normal physiological function from our bodies. Now, if you have a patient that's not intubated and you do a chest x-ray and they have atelectasis, how do we treat them? Well, we treat them with inspiratory maneuvers such as ACUPAP, incentive spirometry, IPPB, or whatever device you use at your facility. The same goes for a ventilated patient. To properly recruit, we have to use inspiratory maneuvers. Remember, to properly recruit, you have to use inspiratory maneuvers, such as APRV. And then what you do is you allow the PEEP to maintain what was recruited during the inspiratory phase. So without PEEP, we would be unable to recruit because everything that we open during the inspiratory phase would be totally lost during the expiratory phase. So PEEP is essential in alveolar recruitment, but it does not actually do the recruiting. Now, in 90% of ventilation cases, this just doesn't matter. It's just words. But in the real sick ventilated patients, the one where we really have to think our way through it, you have to understand the difference. Now, the third benefit we get from inverse ratio ventilation is that it improves pulmonary edema. Most people don't think of this. So just how does it improve pulmonary edema? Well, some think it's because the pressure sort of pushes the fluid back into the tissue, but that's really not true. Now basically, we all have fluid in our lungs. This is normal. Our lungs are designed to handle a certain amount of fluid and can essentially absorb a certain amount of excess fluid back into the tissue. When the lungs become fluid overloaded, this is where we have a problem and pulmonary edema occurs. Now, during the elongated inspiratory phase of inverse ratio ventilation, we're basically holding the lungs open for a longer period of time. And if we're holding the lungs open, that means there is a greater surface area available in which the fluid can reabsorb into. We use this mode a lot in the burn unit where our patients are getting massive amounts of fluid resuscitation. Remember, our skin is designed to hold fluid into our bodies. That's one of the natural functions of our skin. So when someone has a lot of burns and they're missing that skin, they have a lot of dehydration, so it takes a lot of fluid resuscitation in these patients. We have these residents that float in, and they're used to seeing white, fluffy x-rays on all their ventilated patients in a normal ICU. And they expect to see even worse with this massive fluid resuscitation of these patients, but then they see the x-ray, and it looks essentially clear. And the reason is because we're using the proper ventilation strategy to eliminate the pulmonary edema. Of course, no mode of ventilation comes without complications, and with inverse ratio ventilation, the primary problem is patient comfort. Because in order to put a patient in inverse ratio ventilation, you must place the patient on either volume control or pressure control. More often than not, we use pressure control, but basically what you do is you then turn the inspiratory time way up until you create an inverse ratio of at least 2:1. The problem is that since you are now in a control mode, if the patient attempts to take a breath during that long inspiratory phase of ventilation, the machine's going to lock them out. This makes inverse ratio ventilation extremely uncomfortable for the patient. So now, because it is uncomfortable for the patient on this mode of ventilation, what happens is the patient starts to fight the ventilator, and then bad things begin to happen. Remember, the more the patient does this, whether it's fighting the vent or just thrashing around in bed, the more CO2 the body will produce and the more oxygen the body will consume. Now, considering that this patient is sick enough to even consider inverse ratio ventilation, the last thing we need is the patient to be fighting the vent. So in order to combat this, the patient has to be medically paralyzed. We don't like to do this because paralytics have their own long set of risks. You also have an increased mean airway pressure while in inverse ratio ventilation, and that can lead to cardiovascular side effects that are typically manifested by a decrease in the patient's blood pressure. So oftentimes when I'm switching a patient over to APRV or inverse ratio ventilation, I'm going to check the patient's blood pressure before and after I make the switch. I want to make sure that the mode of ventilation I'm using is not the cause of a decreased blood pressure, and the best way is by monitoring. Another complication of inverse ratio ventilation is permissive hypercapnia. And permissive hypercapnia basically means we're going to allow for a higher level of CO2 within the blood. And oftentimes we have to allow for this permissive hypercapnia, and the reason is fairly simple. Because we have a shortened expiratory time, the patient usually just doesn't have enough time to exhale all of the air out of the lungs. This not only traps air in the lungs, which remember we liked because it aids in alveolar recruitment, but it also traps CO2 in the lungs. But since we're trying to get improved oxygenation typically, we're going to allow for a higher CO2 if it's going to give us the oxygenation that the patient needs to survive. All right, that's the end of part 1 of APRV, which is basically a massive review on inverse ratio ventilation. And as usual, we got to talk about our websites. www.$10ceu.ding.com is our social media platform. We try to provide as much free information and content as we possibly can to you. Okay, this content's out there anyway. We're just trying to get it all on one forum, one page. So on that website, you're going to find blog posts, you're going to find discussion forums, all kinds of things that you can interact with others on and discuss topics with. The only thing we ever charge for is continuing education courses. So this particular course on APRV is available on www.$10ceu.com. And here's the good news. Here's the sneak on this. If you see all the YouTube videos that we post on APRV and you decide, you know what, they're good videos, I'd sure like to get some CEUs for it. Well, there's only one CEU, but you can go onto that website and you can take the course. The video will pop up. You don't have to watch the video again. You've seen it all once. Zip through the whole thing, and at the end you'll have to take a quiz. That's mandatory. It's mandated by the AARC in order to get AARC approval, okay? Got to take the quiz. You'll get your certificate. Why not do it? It's $10 and you saw the videos anyway, so you might as well go ahead and get the CEU. And please do me this favor. If you like the video, please remember to check on that little thumbs up that's on there saying that you liked the video. The more of these we get, the more exposure this gets. The more exposure it gets, the more other people will see it and be able to benefit from the content. That's it for now. We are signing off.